Hello, everybody. Welcome in. Hopefully, you made it through a bitterly cold weekend. I'm Jesse Montano. This is Gorilla Sports Off Ice. Today's episode is brought to you by our great friends over at Trusted American Mortgage. Trusted American's salary-based mortgage consultants want to help you get a better interest rate and lower your monthly mortgage payment. Go to trustedamerican.com to see how much money they can help you save today. Hello and welcome in.
Please do not leave your luggage unattended on the station.
Welcome to the show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome in for a Tuesday Off Ice Gorilla Sports podcast. I'm Meghan, Angley, joined by Jesse Montano, who did a wonderful open. I usually struggle with the Trusted American at the beginning. I'm so sorry, Trusted American. I'm excited to talk with you about some things because I'm going to intentionally wear a different hat today and post some questions to you about the state of this team. It's not to key in on the Minnesota loss, just one individual game, but ask broader questions about the team and where they're at, and maybe either dissuade some overreactions within the fan base, reinforce some. We'll see. But I wanted to reflect on where they're at. They're 2-2-0 in this homestand.
It made me laugh. And maybe reinforce some overreactions.
Yeah,
I just love that.
I'm ready to. I'm gonna put on a different hat
Double
from what I
down.
normally wear.
Yeah, I love it.
So it's gonna. I don't even want to call it devil's advocate because maybe they're not the devil. Maybe they're correct, but they're 2-2-0 in the homestand. But they lost. Like in my mind, they lost the New York game because of how they played. I don't think they played it very well.
Process wise, they lost.
It's bad, exactly. And so that's why that doesn't sound like a half bad way to break up the homestand. They still have one more game to go. It's obviously an important one, but they're 5-4-1 in their last 10. And they're now 4 points back of the Wild, 2 points back of Dallas in the Central Division. And so it definitely adds emphasis to losing important divisional points against Minnesota, and why there is maybe some frustration that the hunger wasn't there more for this Avs group against Minnesota, because it was for Minnesota. Minnesota had just lost 3 games and they came in a little bit hungrier and it persisted. Whereas for the Avs, good, not great first period, but that hunger just evaded them and they didn't match the hunger that Minnesota brought to that game. And it gives me some concerns. And I've seen some concern around where the team's heads are at, concern that they're not serious enough about this season. And so I'll put on that different hat for a second. The odds were stacked against them from the jump. They knew they were going to be missing key players before opening night. 0-4 start, league worst goaltending there for a bit. Did they get too comfortable losing at times on account of being underdogs that they've forgotten how to win? Or did chasing those games earlier in the year, climbing back from 3+ goal deficits, exhaust them, the top guys in particular, to the point of running on empty now?
First of all, I'm glad that this is the overall topic today, because I've actually got something that I don't want to say on my first answer, because I'm just going to find myself repeating it over and over. But I think I think this is a great topic for today, because I do think we're in an interesting stretch of the season for a couple of reasons. One, this is just an interesting stretch of the year, every year, in between Christmas and whether it be the All-Star break, the Olympic break, this year the Four Nations break, whatever it is. This is kind of what I consider to be the dog days a bit, because we're still pretty far out from trade deadline. You're not really having a lot of those really intense conversations yet about that.
Right.
These games all matter. To your point, the Avs are in the middle of a very important stretch playing Dallas, Minnesota, Winnipeg. These games all matter, but also, like, we were leaving the room last night on our way down to talk to Jared, and I made the comment to a couple of our cohorts where I just said, man, I don't know what to talk to these guys about because it's such a roller coaster right now. And it's so hard when talking to Mikko Rantanen to key in too hard on one individual loss.
Definitely.
While at the same time not going overboard with like the Dallas win. I even think that there was a question in our post game that was directed at you of like is this the page being turned for the Avs? And you were like, well, I don't want to say that because it's one game. Yes, this was a really good game. It was what they needed to do. It was the response you wanted to see, but now they got to keep doing it. So I think we are in the middle of this a little bit. But I do also believe in what I said a couple nights ago in the post game. You got to start molding and figuring out who you are.
Right.
I think this team's still figuring out who they are, Meghan. And I think a lot of it has to do with what you're asking about. The first third of the season.
Right.
When Jared Bednar even admitted the expectations for the work ethic and the process remain the same, but they were allowing themselves some grace in the results, knowing that they were so depleted. And it wasn't realistic to hold this team to the same standard as the team that you hope you will build up to at some point this season. With that, I also think that you had a major shakeup in net that kind of reset the identity of who this team was. I think Sam Malinsky really showed coming out of camp that he's got the ability to be a legitimate top 6 defenseman, meaning in the lineup every night, and maybe even beyond that. Well, with his play taking a little bit of an expected slide, he's a rookie playing his first full NHL season. He hit a little bit of a wall, the struggles of Josh Mann. I just think that every year you have a different makeup of the team. Let's change sports here, right? Let's take the Kansas City Chiefs. Won the Super Bowl the last 2 years. This is a perennial contender. Yet every year, that roster looks a little bit different. The key pieces who were there from the year before aren't still there, or they were shuffled around, or they're a year older, or they priced themselves out. That is a team who, despite them going for a three-peat here over the next couple weeks, has to reassess and redefine who they are every year. And it helps when you've got a head coach like Andy Reid and a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes who have been there, who are at the top of their game and all that stuff. And in the same way, the Avalanche always know at a baseline roughly who they're going to be. They know they've got guys like Nathan McKinnon who are helping drive the bus and Cale Makar. And then you got a coach in Jared Bednar who's got a good pulse on the team. But where this is different from football is it's a much longer season. There's a lot more games. The grind is more intense. And your players that are third and fourth string have to play a much more significant role in hockey, right? So we know what the core of this team is going to be. We know they're going to work hard. We know they're going to play with speed. We know that they've got talent and they're going to be able to put pucks in the net. And we know that they like to defend hard. But there's a lot of pieces of this team that are either new from the start of the year, are new on any given night with the call-ups, or we've seen some shakeups within the roster throughout the course of this season. I think this is a team who at its core is a contender and who knows what they want to do. But I think it's a flawed team trying to figure out who they really are and how this version of the Avalanche wins with consistency going into the back half of the year. So I think it's actually a combination of the couple things that you mentioned. I think they got really confident in their ability to come back in games. And I think they also are very confident in, well, once we get these pieces back, we'll be able to go. And we've just gone a little bit longer into the season without them getting these pieces back. So I know there's a really long-winded answer for me to say, I think this is a team that's figuring out who they are and at different stretches of this season have maybe gotten overconfident in the flashes that they've shown of, nope, that's who we are. And there's still a lot of work and a lot of process this team has to go through to get back to no, we can just show up on any given night and dial it up to 100. To tie my analogy together, like we see with the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to matter what happens with that team on a week-to-week basis. They have found out, or they have figured out the formula for how they put together a winning game plan game after game. I think this team is still doing that.
I think it's really significant to call out the opening third of this season and how they might have granted themselves some more allowances in areas because they were playing with a severely depleted roster, and everybody was on the same page in terms of the goaltending situation. Everybody knew what that was. And so I think it papered over bad habits. And I think there were still players, though, trying to set that standard at the same time. And so there are parts of those 10-game segments where defensively they were sound, at least in terms of process, but they weren't necessarily getting the results. And at times I would criticize them for playing too much from an individual lens, like too much of trying to be the hero to the point of overcompensating and making mistakes. And I think there's two different ways of saying nobody's coming to save you. At the opening of the year, nobody's coming to save you. This is the roster that you have. And that's where we saw players like Nathan MacKinnon, who continue to try and be that hero, be that savior in almost protest of this, nobody's coming to save you. And I think I look at the rest of the roster, though, on a nightly basis, nobody's coming to save you. Nathan MacKinnon might, but it's not guaranteed. And I think that's where I'm looking to players like a Sam Alinsky, who set an expectation for themselves by exceeding it at the start of the year. Sam Alinsky was more than we thought he was going to be. But as a result of being that, he set a new standard. He set a new expectation. And so I maintain that I don't think he has played badly. His New York game was a standout as one of his worst games. But beyond that, I don't think this stretch was bad. I don't think he was actively hurting the team. I just think he fell below the standard that he had set for himself. And that's where I'm looking at players like a Ross Colton or a Casey Middlestat. Like, you have set standards for yourself and what you could be, whether it be earlier version of Ross Colton in this year or post-deadline playoff Casey Middlestat, that when we see a version of you that falls below that, this nobody's coming to save us, I'm saying that in a different font. It's like, you can't just rely on the McKinnons and the Makars, because though one of them usually shows up on a nightly basis, it's not a guarantee. And that's where I think, to your point, finding identity, that's where this team is at, is the players that I just mentioned, the Middlestat, the Malinsky, the Coltons. They're trying to find their way, one, back to that ceiling, to where we've seen them be better. And that's not a criticism of someone like Ross Colton, who I think plays his heart out every night. But I do think there is an element of understanding role that's important for each of these players to maximize, to like get the best out of them, that they're still searching for. And some of that has been because they've been forced to play different roles. And that's been extremely challenging. I mean, it's actually interesting. Like, Malinsky, with Manson out of the lineup, tried to assume a second pair role and experienced challenges there. And I think, to your point, it's wear and tear on the body that he's not exactly used to either. I'm also giving a long-winded answer, so I'm going to give a pause here, because you looked like you had something you wanted to say too.
Well, no, you called out, you didn't call them out, but you named a couple of the players who I was going to circle back to, because again, this is so here. Let me also say this, and this is the part that I was going to maybe say part of it. So Ross Colton, I think, is a great example. What is he on this team? And that's not a question at Ross Colton. I think Ross Colton has been good.
To be fair to him, they're not quite sure.
Right. And I'm more of asking that for, like, okay, well, if everything's going according to plan, I think ideally he's your 3C. Like, I think that's how the Avs drew it up. You know what I mean? Like this offseason coming into the year, if everything goes right, no, he's a really key part of your middle six. Well, he's played for the last week riding shotgun next to Nathan MacKinnon and Mikko Rantanen. And again, he's played fine. Now, this is not me criticizing Ross Colton, but it's like, okay, is that who you guys are? Or are you something else? Are you a team that that piece with Ross Colton where, right now today we're looking at the bottom 6 of this lineup and going, oh, not great. Okay, well, does it feel a lot different if it's Ross Colton, Parker Kelly, and Logan O'Connor, and then Miles Wood and Kibby Ranta and someone else on your, in Gabe Landeskog in your fourth? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I think that certainly looks and feels different. So I do think there is an element of it where, again, when you are looking back and assessing the team on an 82 game segment, and to your point, not looking at what happened yesterday afternoon against the Minnesota Wild, those are the types of questions that I have are, okay, well, how does this team look with the way that they planned? And how much has that been kind of thrown into chaos just throughout the season? This isn't the version of the team that you expected. And I think they're trying to figure out how to make the most of the version that they have at their disposal. The other thing I'll point out, this team's in a really good spot. A win yesterday would have put them in second place in the division, 5 points back of the team that they're playing next. And so that is the other thing that I will remind people to keep in mind is while we are talking today about how this team fixes themselves and all that stuff, like they're in a decent spot. And that's the part that I'm going to come back to as we get closer to the end of the show of flawed teams. So don't let me forget to circle back to this. But that is the other thing that I will remind folks is, well, if the Avs win that game yesterday, 3-1, if the roles are reversed, regardless of how the process looks, you feel pretty damn good today if you're the Avs waking up in second place in the division with a chance to knock off the Winnipeg Jets and close that gap to 3 points. I know that's a hypothetical, but you're literally 20 minutes away from that last night when you go into the third period tied 1-1. That's mostly a comment. Some of the comments coming through the chat.
Yeah.
But just an important thing to keep in mind.
Well, it is worth talking about because game 50 is going to be the Boston game coming up this weekend. So we're going 49 into 50, and that's when we're going to reevaluate this last stretch of the 10-game segment here in this recent one. But collectively, like when you look at games 1 through 25, and then through what's kind of the second half of that now, 26, we're into 48, but we'll be close to getting to 50 here soon. They're a better team now than they were in that first half if we're looking at 25 to 50. I know that's maybe a weird way to break down an 82-game season, but that's where we're at, right? 1 through 25, win percentage around .520, second most in goals against. In this like closer to 50 segment, they've got a .674 win percentage, and they have, I want to say, second in the league for goals for. And so they're pretty competitive in terms of coming up with goal scoring, despite things like getting shut out by the Winnipeg Jets and not being able to find those goals and trying to come back in yesterday's Minnesota game. That was frustrating. There was even this feeling of when they're just down 1 goal, something about though chasing the game, even just a 1-0 game, felt wrong to me. And I think it's because of the consistency issue in having a bad game against Chicago and then responding in such a dominant way in Minnesota. And that's keeping in mind, Minnesota is pretty depleted right now. They're still without Kaprizov, Spurgeon, Brodin. And so to their credit, they're still pretty depleted. Like they get Faber back in this game and it makes a difference for them, obviously. But I think that's where people they're riding those highs and lows and it's giving them whiplash. It's like
100%,
you just had
Meghan.
such a great outing against Dallas. And this is how we're going to respond to a hungry Minnesota team on the heels of a 3-game losing streak. Like you couldn't have matched that hunger a little bit more. And I'm not actually that panicked over it, but I get the frustration around it. I get why that lack of consistency and seeing these great responses to games that they, like, oh, great. They respond to the Edmonton game with this Dallas game. How great. Oh, and they follow it up with a Minnesota stinker.
So I agree with you. I agree with everything that you just said, that it's, and it was my question to Jared Bednar yesterday when we kicked off the post-game presser was, is that result more frustrating than just the loss because of the way the team played against Dallas and because of the implications of the game? And he said, yes. And so again, I think it's fair to feel that type of way, but here's the overall point that I'm going to make that I will now officially be referencing throughout the rest of the show. Salary cap went flat in 2020 for 4 years. And it had a massive ripple effect throughout the entire league. And teams that were at the top that had players they needed to pay couldn't do so. Teams that were at the bottom had more cap flexibility and were able to spend some of that money and make themselves more competitive. With the cap set to jump maybe even close to $10 million this summer, Megan, for the first time in half a decade, we're going to start to see a break from that trend. It's the number one reason why I'm remain so confident that the Avs will keep Mikko Rantanen. Teams are going to be able to spend again. This season, more than ever, there's parity, and there are almost nothing but flawed teams top to bottom. Whether people want to admit it or angrily deny it today, the Avalanche are a cup contender. In the same way that the Toronto Maple Leafs are a cup contender, and the Florida Panthers are a cup contender, and the Carolina Hurricanes, and the New Jersey Devils, and the Winnipeg Jets, and the Vegas Golden Knights, and the Edmonton Oilers, all are cup contending teams that are flawed to varying extents. There was a comment that came through earlier that said, the Penguins are winning more than the Avs are recently. Not true. Penguins are 3-4-3 in their last 10. Avs 5-4-1. So that one's factually not true. But let me run you through some of these top teams in their last 10 games, Megan. Florida Panthers, 5-4-1. Tampa Bay Lightning, 5-4-1. Carolina Hurricanes, 6-3-1. The New Jersey Devils, which we had so many people earlier this season saying, look at the Devils. That's what a real contender looks like. 2-5-3 in their last 10. The Boston Bruins, fighting for their playoff lives. 3-5-2 in their last 10. The Winnipeg Jets, 4-4-2 in their last 10. The Minnesota Wild, 6-4-0 in their last 10, including a 3-game losing streak. The Vegas Golden Knights, 4-5-1. Colorado Avalanche, 4-5-1 in their last 10 games. The point I'm making here, this season, these last 2 seasons really, have been something that we haven't really seen in the NHL in a long time. There are no runaway contending teams. The closest team you could make the argument for on that is the Washington Capitals, which almost nobody even had on their playoff board coming into this season. This is a season where all of your top teams are going through stretches like this where everyone's trying to figure out who they are. What is their identity? Again, we heard from everyone when the Dallas Stars knocked off the Avs that the Stars were going to be running away with the division, that the Avs were never going to go anywhere because they were going to have to go through the Stars. Well, the Stars have one more win on the season than the Avs at this point. And yet we still see them and people talking in the chat about like, oh, well, that's the standard the Avs need to get to. All of these teams are struggling. All of these teams are trying to figure out who they are because they're dealing with injuries, lack of depth, salary cap issues, all of that. And so that's why I'm saying, like, at the beginning of this year, this version of the Avs are trying to figure out who they are. And look, this comment right here, I get it, but all those teams are top 3 in their division. Had the Avs won one game yesterday, the Avs would be sitting in second place in the division. So that's what I'm saying. When you live and die by the result of every game, yeah, it feels really bad and it feels really great. This is a flawed Avalanche team. They've got to address things at the deadline. You and I were just talking earlier today. I think Sam Malinsky needs to be back in this lineup. And there's a whole lot more that we're going to get into here. But I do just think that a lot of this is this group is figuring out who they are. And yeah, they're going to look bad on some nights. until they find that right formula and until you have a few players raise the level of their game, we're going to continue to go through this.
Something about reading off those records that I think is valuable is something you brought to my attention around the conversation with Malinsky, and that is with the Four Nations break being a longer than normal break for the league. The schedule has been jam-packed here in January in particular, but also, looking back at December and then just looking at the Avs specifically, how much they were on the road that last month. I do think it's worth mentioning that this is probably a tough stretch of hockey around the league because of the way the schedule has been set this year, embracing for the Four Nations break being 2 weeks versus the All-Star break being a week. And I think it's worth noting because the whole title of this podcast is a little bit baity. Are the Avs running on empty, right? I do think there's a little bit of fatigue that has set in because of the 10-game segments. This isn't my least favorite.
No.
We've seen worse results, but it is not my favorite in terms of some process. I also think there's some fatigue that we have to account for here.
100%. We've talked to Jared Bednar about it and other players. This is the first time in over a decade that we've had this type of break built in for the league. There are a lot of players who have never experienced an Olympic year schedule like this. Connor McDavid, just as a reference point for people, has never played in an Olympic year NHL schedule where it's compressed like this, let alone, any younger players, a player like Sam Malinsky. So I definitely think fatigue is a factor. And the point I'm more of trying to make, because again, there was someone else who said, hey, well, let's not look at top teams in the league as a record. The Avs are a top 10 team in the NHL. The Avs, again, whether fans like it or not, based on the result from last night, the Avs are a top team in the league. And that's really the point I'm trying to make here, is that every contender this year is flawed. Usually you've got one or two teams that kind of separate from the pack in no, those are like the elite teams. The rest of these teams are flawed, and how can they catch up? This flat salary cap for 4 years put the entire league in a situation where the top half really had to do some shuffling and juggling of the salary cap and how they handled players and how they handled contracts and all that. And it has gotten us to a point where temporarily, because I think when the cap goes up, it's going to fix this, every team is flawed. And if you look at the race in the East, it's from 5 positions out of the playoffs till the top wildcard spot's 4 points. The West isn't really like that. The Avs are 10 points clear of being out of the playoffs, and they currently sit in wildcard 1. So the West is a little bit less competitive top to bottom than the East. But the point is, all of the top teams are kind of going through the same thing as the Avs, and they're all dealing with the fatigue. And I think it's compounding what we're talking about with the Avs in particular, of trying to figure out what your identity is, who are even the players that are available to you. Okay, is Jure Anala, do we need a plan for this guy to be playing for the next 25 games, or is he a stopgap till Val gets back? Okay, Sam Malinsky, are we having him step out for a couple games to recapture his game, or do we want Keaton Middleton out there trying to throw his weight around and taking penalties every night? Because we like the physicality, right? These are all things that the Avs are trying to figure out. What does this iteration of the team need? And I think when you stack the condensed, exhausting schedule on top of that, to your point, Megan, I think it's just making everything that much more difficult.
The Middleton thing, it's tough because I like both players. I like Middleton.
Hold on. Wild card team doesn't make Avs top 10 in the NHL. No, it doesn't. That's just where they are in the standings. That's not me saying they're a top 10 team in the NHL. That's just where they're tied with the Florida Panthers for 10th in the league, and they were as high as 7th this past week. That's not me just making that up. That's just where they are. So I just had to make sure to throw that out there.
No. Speak your truth, Jesse. I'm glad you clarified that. I don't want to derail on Middleton Malinsky for too much longer.
Yeah.
There's key differences in these players. I think matchup by matchup, physicality makes sense. Why a Middleton might get the nod against a team that you're bracing for a more physical matchup. But the things that Malinsky can add to a game that he's been struggling to find, are so much more and have more impact than what Middleton can bring. And it doesn't have to be this or that. It doesn't have to be Middleton or Malinsky. I think Middleton has come up huge in eating up some PK minutes away from players like Makar, Taves, Manson, Gerard, who typically are utilized there. Middleton can spot shift in on the PK and be pretty reliable there in a way that Malinsky, it is not necessarily his strength in the way that it can be for Middleton. But the offensive impact that Malinsky can have and the defensive responsibility.
Yep.
He's like a Taves player in that he doesn't necessarily play the body, but he makes good decisions. And defensively in his own end, that can be a strong suit for him. And so I agree with the assessment that I'd like to see Malinsky bring a little more physicality to his game coming out of this 3-game rest that he's had. But I just think it's an apples to oranges thing to try and say like Middleton is the clear-cut better player to be in the lineup nightly over Malinsky. I think they both bring different things, and what Middleton can bring, I don't think has to be in the lineup nightly. I think situationally it makes sense.
Well, and again, this is where I go back to the Avs trying to figure out this version of the Avs trying to figure out what the identity is. Because the reason you play a guy like Keaton Middleton is for the reasons that you just listed. Physicality, blocking shots, killing penalties, things like that. Well, last year that was Jack Johnson, who you felt more than comfortable with doing that. And when relative to Keaton Middleton, how about that? So, I mean, there's a guy.
Dare I say I might like Keaton Middleton more than Jack Johnson?
Well, I know, you know what, we can move past that.
No, hold on. I've seen criticisms of the third pairing, and I just think back to what it was with Jack Johnson and Caleb Jones, who they wouldn't play. And I'm just like, I don't know. I actually think this is a better situation than last year.
Well, so I guess let me put it this way. DeHaan and Middleton last night, Jared Bednar has way less faith in that pairing than he did Johnson and Johnson. You know what I mean? From 2 seasons ago.
True.
Or even Jack Johnson last year, despite him not maybe being at the level that he had been in previous years with the Avs, Jared Bednar knew he could put him out there, and he knew where he knows where he's supposed to go. He's not going to do anything stupid, and he's going to get in lanes just for argument's sake. You know what I mean? So
I felt the mobility became a huge issue for Jack Johnson.
I agree with you completely. But so what Jared Bednar is trying to do right now is trying to figure out, okay, well, because he usually uses that third pairing as a little bit of a safety net.
Totally.
I can put them out there to go shut guys down. Keaton Middleton, Calvin DeHaan are not my shutdown pair. I don't know about you, Megan, but that is not who I'm rolling out to protect a 1-goal lead in the last minute. And I think he's trying to figure out, what is this mix? Do we need someone else? Is this not right? Josh Manson is supposed to be another one of those guys, and his play has not been up to snuff recently. So how do you arrange this defense? What players do you put in the lineup? How do you deploy them? What pairings do you match them up? That's all stuff that Jared Bednar is trying to get ironed out between now and April, so that come the playoffs, he feels comfortable in who his pairings are, what it's about, but we don't know right now. He doesn't know, and he's trying to find the right mix.
I think what has changed the complexion of this conversation completely has been Manson not looking like himself.
For sure.
And I don't want to overreact in the same way that I'm saving space for Casey Middlestat to be a better player than we've seen. I can hope on that with Manson too, but it makes a huge difference when your second pair guy is making bad decisions. I think it shines a light on the third pair because there's a lack of trust. They're more sheltered in minutes, Middleton in particular. I think there's a little more trust with DeHaan. But even then, it's like when your second pair guy isn't going, that turns the focus to what the third pair is doing. And when they're also making some mistakes and there isn't a trust there, that's where I think the dissatisfaction with the third pair is brought to light in a way that I don't know that we would have been so uncomfortable with DeHaan Malinsky as the third pair if Manson was playing like himself right now.
And it's not just Manson not playing like himself. It's the fact that Josh Manson is supposed to be your guy who's not same. Cale Makar has a physical edge to his game. That's not his hallmark.
Right.
Devon Taves, great defender, but he's not the bruising push out from front of the net. Sam Girard, you've heard me rant on it for years. I think he's such an underrated defender. He gaps up well. He's got great stick, great active stick. things like that. Good feet. He's clearly not, you're going to the corner and win the battle type of guy.
Shoving guys at the net front.
Right. That's what Josh Manson's supposed to bring to your top four. That's what he's done really well for the Avs the last 2 years in the top four. So when he's not going that way, you say, okay, well, shit, can we get Keaton Middleton to be that guy? Okay, he's not getting it done to the level we want. Calvin DeHaan, that guy. No, and we know Sam Malinsky probably isn't going to be that guy.
No.
There is a part of my brain that finds a little bit of a causality between Josh Manson's struggles and the fact that Malinsky isn't in the lineup. That if Josh Manson wasn't struggling the way that he would, okay, well, maybe you don't need one of those other two bigger guys in your lineup on that bottom pair. So I do think I think you're right in saying Josh Manson struggles, Malinsky not in the lineup, maybe not playing your best group of six. I think there could be some correlation there.
I do too, because I think as much as, I won't go down this rabbit hole, but there's a reason Manson's role is important, and you mentioned because it's not same. He brings something a little bit different, and it needs to be represented in the back end in some way. And so when Manson's not really meeting that expectation, they still need physicality represented somewhere.
Yep.
That's where Middleton really comes in. And so that's where, to your point, they do have to reevaluate. Like, can Manson get back to where he was, or some degree of being close to it? I get he's dealt with injuries. That has complicated things. But if he can't get back to doing what he does best, they are going to have to reevaluate then how the back end is constructed, because it's having a trickle down effect that's making everybody a little bit worse. And I don't doubt too that this puts stress and emphasis on Taves and Makar as the top pair as well, especially when there's a lack of trust in that bottom pair.
Well, and again, we go back to, this team needing to decide who they are, how they're constructing. And I'm trying to find a good list here really quickly. But go ahead.
While you look for it, I was thinking about how I looked so tired on the last podcast episode. And something that helps me when I'm feeling a little bit tired is 7 Brew Coffee. It's a one-of-a-kind drive-through and walk-up experience with a fast and friendly crew that is waiting to serve you. From rich, bold coffee to refreshing energy drinks, smoothies, teas, milkshakes, and more, 7 Brew has you covered with over 20,000 flavor combinations. There's a perfect drink for everyone. At 7 Brew, they believe in cultivating kindness with every cup, and their fully customizable menu is just the beginning. Before you hit the road, power up with 7 Brew and Firestone and experience the coffee revolution. If only the Avs had 20,000 D-pair combinations.
Seriously, which by the end of the season, we might get there with forward combinations that they have used.
Scary, but true.
Right. So I'm just trying to find really just kind of like an overall trade bait list for this year, because the example I was going to use was, you're trying to figure, okay, well, if Josh Manson can't get back to that level, is he better suited on that third pair next to Sam Malinsky, and we need to go out and bring in someone who can play next to Sam Girard? I'm not necessarily saying that's what they're going to do or anything like that, but I'm just making the point of those are the types of conversations that you're having to have right now of where are we? What do we need? Where do we have deficiencies in the lineup? And okay, over the course of these 10 game stretches, and it's the reason why Jared Bednar likes to assess over 10 games instead of after every game, is because, okay, over these 10 games, what do we have? Where did we see a need? Where did we see? All right, in the second 10 game segment, games 10 to 20, we really struggled. And I'm going to simplify this to make it, not confusing. We really felt like we had a deficiency with that bottom pairing. We couldn't trust them. We couldn't roll them out there. Well, shit. In segment 5, we still feel that way. Let's see how we feel at the end of segment 6 going into the Four Nations break, and really take those 2 weeks to assess how we want to handle things. Those are the types of conversations that they're having, because they are trying to figure out who they are.
Yeah. And I think it's been prompted by, to your earlier point, this is not the lineup that they expected on January 21st. They thought there would maybe be some more reinforcement and not nearly as much rotating loss in the lineup as we've seen, which leads me to my next question. Is there any one absence that has hurt them the most between Druin, Manson, Nichushkin, Lehkonen, obviously Landy? That doesn't count in this conversation.
I actually liked the way that Petey put it last week. Like, Gabe's kind of in a separate bucket other than injured.
Totally separate bucket.
It's Val. It's Val, full stop. Look, I was talking with Kobe the other day in the locker room, and we were talking about the Olympics next year and saying, like, look, geopolitical stuff aside, for the sake of the conversation, I hope Russia's at the Olympics next year, because there's so many good players there. And as we were going through it, we were realizing, like, it's probably top line Val on a team that has the potential to be loaded. This is one of the league's elite players when he's at his best. It's the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the recent stretch. I read off 4, 5, and 1. You've been without Val Nichushkin for 3 weeks now, which Minnesota without Kirill Kaprizov, yeah, they lost 3 games in a row. They're 6-4 in 10 games. That makes sense. That adds up. Yes, you've got Nathan McKinnon, you've got Cale Makar, and that obviously helps. But you're missing a guy like Val Nichushkin, who, like what we were talking about with the defense, is a player who breaks from the mold of Nathan McKinnon, playmaker, elite shooter, Mikko Rantanen, elite shooter, offensively for Cale Makar, elite shooter, elite passer. Val Nichushkin is your two-way, below the goal lines, in front of the net, can't push him off the puck, wins every battle type of player. He is the replacement for Gabe Landeskog. So you're kind of 2 spots down on the Gabe Landeskog depth chart, if you will. This is a different team when Val Nichushkin's in the lineup. The record bears that out. The analytics bear that out. This is a better team when Val Nichushkin's in the lineup. It's part of the reason why so many people, understandably, wanted him gone after it happened in the playoffs last year, because it's like, yeah, you're such an important part of this team, and if you can't realize that, then we need to find someone who does.
Right. Because when you're gone, if there's no ability to fill those shoes, which there wouldn't have been, it destroys the complexion of the top 6.
Right.
And I think right now, the way that Manson not being himself affects the rest of the decor, I think Middlestat not being himself affects the rest of the forward group, such that Nichushkin's absence is made worse by that. If Middlestat was playing closer to expectation from what we saw in the playoffs and post-deadline, even the first 10 games of this season, I think we could survive Nichushkin's absence a little bit more. But what he brings, in the same way that Manson brings something a little bit different, what Nichushkin brings, especially to that top 6, is such a necessary component in the net front presence, the physicality, because he is such a powerful player. The possession game overall is made better with Nichushkin because of that. Having workers like a Lehkonen and now a Drouin is important too, but they're supported by the likes of a Nichushkin, and not having him there, they don't have enough work in the top 6. And I think that's where players like McKinnon aren't playing to even their best, because there's a lack of trust and there's maybe even some second guessing that's happening, and it just affects the overall big picture. And obviously you don't want the scoring to solely come from the top 6, but I think that's why it's in such dire straits right now.
Well, then let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. If Val Nichushkin's in the lineup, how much better do you feel about your top 9 if it's Val, Nate, Mikko, Drouin, Middlestat, Lehkonen, especially the way that line's been playing, Colton, Kelly, OC? That sure seems like it makes a difference to me. That's a top 9 you feel pretty comfortable with. Haven't even mentioned Gabe Landeskog's name or Miles Wood's name. Bring those 2 back and drop them on Juuso Parsonen's wing on the 4th line in the playoffs if you get there. You know what I mean? Like, it's that one piece allows you to move a couple guys down into roles that they're maybe a little bit more suited for. I know we laugh and joke about all the Kiviranta stuff, but like, he's a 4th liner. That's where he's most effective. In the playoffs last year, we saw him be a dominant 4th line player. You don't want him playing up further in your lineup. You want him to be the best fourth liner on the ice. And so getting a guy like Val back allows you to redistribute that talent a little bit more.
In seeing Kiviranta in elevated roles too, the more challenging matchups make his defensive game suffer, because I actually think he's a pretty defensively responsible player, and the line that he's on is usually responsible in that sense too. But in seeing him play tougher matchups, that's where there's weaknesses. And so you're not getting the best out of Kiviranta here either. Juuso Parssinen, another player that I think has so much more to give than we've been able to see because he's been limited. He's been sheltered, and that fourth line is just not really complete at the moment. And to Vaguely's point about Drouin, when Drouin's out of the lineup, we see the hole that is left there in his absence. And I think it all still goes back to the Casey Middlestat of it all. Like, if Casey Middlestat was playing to expectation right now, I don't think these absences would be felt in the same way, because you're clamoring to have them back in for a reason. One, they do make a difference. They add to this lineup, whether it be Drouin or Nichushkin. But I look at, when Nichushkin was back briefly with Middlestat, it didn't help Middlestat's game specifically, but that's where Middlestat needing to get his game on track is a huge part of the conversation too.
Totally.
Alongside the value of Nichushkin, as well as Drouin, who I think is also a very vital part of this top six.
100%. And you calling out, Middlestat needing to get back to the level, and you made this argument off the top of, well, yeah, once you kind of set benchmark standards for yourself, it's now incumbent on you to make sure that you're getting there. The Avs brought in Casey Middlestat based on the way that he was playing, and then extended him and gave him the responsibility here based on what he did after he got to Colorado. Now he's got to get there. You can't. I'm trying to think of the right ways to say this. You can't bury the Avs and Jared Bednar and the management because Casey Middlestat's game fell off a cliff for 2 months. They weren't expecting that either. No. They're as surprised as you are. They thought that was a set and forget. We don't need to worry about it. Casey has come in and show us he can play playoff style. He can be physical. He can play fast. He can buy into the systems. And boy, oh boy, is that kid skilled. And especially the way he started the season. It was like, yes, this is exactly what we invested in because we thought his game would translate. And, like I said, it fell off a cliff. And suddenly you're having to scramble to try to figure out how to fill that hole internally because you're not just going to go dump off Casey Middlestat 6 months after you got him because he was going through a slump. So there's so many layers to this that, it's easy to look at the team and say, yeah, they got issues. Yeah, they definitely do. Just like every other team in the league.
Yeah. So many things come to the mind. Right off the top of my head. What am I trying to say? So many things come to mind right off the top of my head for big issues going on around the league. And the solution isn't necessarily in sight. Now, with the Avs, Casey Middlestat figuring it out isn't a guarantee. So I get in that way, it's not necessarily a solution in sight either. With Middlestat, I still feel in my gut it boils down to confidence. And this has been a hit to his confidence unlike any he's experienced before. And so I think it's going to require a solution unlike any he's had to implement before. And I think it's going to be challenging for him. I still have a lot of belief in him. I know that maybe feels crazy to say because I've keyed in on him a lot in this episode, but I still have a lot of belief in Casey Middlestat.
Well, I take keying in on him as there's expectations there and there is a sense of belief. And that's why you key in on, not you, the proverbial you key on it saying, what is this that we're looking at? Because this isn't what we expect. So I don't think it's weird at all that you would say that you still have belief in him.
And I wanted to look at the Jets game coming up a little bit too. There was one more team philosophy question though that I wanted to ask, and I want to say it was related to coaching. I think I remember it's the cheerleading comment from Bednar.
I thought this was a really interesting comment.
No, I did too. I wanted to talk about it because I look at the issues on the power play, for example, how they're not moving their feet. They're not moving. That's frustrating. I'm not a coach, but that's frustrating just looking at it like, okay, well then how do you fix that? And he talks about bringing out the pom-poms, not in response to fixing the power play specifically. This is me reading between the lines though. Like, you at times probably have to call out your top players, but I'm sure you can only play that card every so often.
You have to do what with the top players?
Call them out.
Yep. Yeah.
And I'm sure, though, as a coach, you have to play that card carefully. You don't want to be going to it all the time and riding them too hard to the point of they just tune you out. Like, in the way that I try not to use profanity, so that when I do, it's taken a little more seriously.
Right.
I imagine Bednar can't just call out the top guys anytime that he doesn't like something. And so I just wonder, with the cheerleading comment, is that how you interpreted it? Like,
So
he has to be supportive when he can?
I took that as there's nothing else I can say to you guys.
He can't say, I'm going to go out back and slap somebody across the face.
And he can't get out there and get on the ice and drop the gloves to get someone going. And it's not even like like I took that as like, yeah, that's not an X's and O's problem. I can't coach my way out of that. I've got to do everything I can to get these guys going so that somebody gets their legs moving.
Right.
Because again, I can't jump out there and start a fight the way Jared Bednar would when he was a player if his team needed energy. He can't do that. So I took it as I've got to get vocal. I've got to yell, and I've got to get these guys motivated in whatever way that Jared Bednar just puts on his motivation hat. To try to get them to get some energy going. That was how I took it. There's nothing I can do to coach out of this. You guys got to get your legs moving.
It's stressful to hear that, not from Bednar or anything that he should or shouldn't be doing, but more so you look at the fact that these are professional athletes and they should be self-motivated to play their best, to be competitive. It should be, in their DNA to have that killer instinct that we've talked about is lacking on the power play in particular.
Yep.
And I don't want to accuse anyone of not having compete in these games, especially looking at the effort a player like McKinnon oftentimes single-handedly tries to make in launching a comeback. So I don't want this to sound like I'm calling out any one person in particular. I guess I just look at the power play and it just feels so unacceptable. It's like, why aren't you moving?
So power play, I think, is different. And I agree with everything that you're saying. Like, that's one where it's just like, that's not even a Ray Bennett issue. That's like, move your feet, move from the place that you're standing. The not having their legs thing, you've heard me tell this story a bunch of times. Josh Manson, some mornings you get up and it's a 7-minute mile. Other mornings you get up and it's 12.
Right.
That I do think is a real thing that just happens sometimes.
Well, especially right now.
Correct.
With what we talked about leading up to the Four Nations.
Correct.
Scheduling.
And I think if you look around the league, again, you don't even have to look that far. Minnesota just lost 3 in a row. Winnipeg got bopped last night. Like, it happens. I think you do need to, as a pro athlete, be doing everything you can to mitigate the frequency at which that's happening.
Because across the board,
power play is different.
When they move their feet, whether it be power play or 5v5, like looking at Middlestat and the game against Dallas and why that was successful, I don't think Middlestat's lazy. But he does need to move his feet more. It rewards him when he does. And I think that line deserves another chance because now through 2 games, this last one was not good for that line with Drouin and Lehkonen. I think it was an execution issue. I don't think it's an effort-based issue, but the team as a whole needs to be moving their feet more. And to your point, the Jets come into town on the heels of a 5-2 loss to Utah. And so every team is experiencing their weird ups and downs right now.
Where they gave up 4 goals in like 4.5 minutes worth of gameplay. It was like the last 90 seconds of the first and the first 2 minutes of the second period. The game just completely ran away from them. So, yeah, other teams have struggles too. I know it's hard to believe.
After getting shut out on the Av side, going into Winnipeg last, they have a chance to split this series. I think it's important to do so because Winnipeg is the team that they're gunning for in Central and, a team that if they want to make it to a Stanley Cup final, they'll have to get through Winnipeg. That's just my belief at this point. And as a result of that, I think it's important to split this series in the regular season. And because they got shut out, and I look at the way that creating offense was difficult for them against Minnesota, I actually don't view it as a strong defensive effort from Minnesota. They were doing great things to manage their lanes and block lanes to the net, but I think that it was an execution issue on behalf of the Avs more than anything against Minnesota. Truthfully, they were missing the net. They were bobbling pucks.
Oh my God, they're missing the net. Yeah.
And I actually think that's the larger issue. And so Jets, a defensively sound team, also with good lane management, I think they're just going to have to move their feet more and come with that killer instinct. I think it's going to require shooting more. I think they were trying to, but they're missing the net. That's that's where it just needs to be better. Get more pucks on net, more bodies to the net,
Megan.
And I think that's how you beat the Winnipeg Jets tomorrow.
I told you yesterday in the press box, I love what Petey said, that when he was a coach in the NHL, that sometimes the message would eventually be shoot the puck. If you're struggling offensively, get in the zone, 2 passes, and someone put it to the net and somebody follow it there. Look, I'm not a coach at the NHL level. I don't know what those discussions are that Jared Bednar's having with this group offensively. There does seem to be a reluctance for them to shoot the puck. And when they are, they're whistling pucks wide or into shin pads. I do think that this team could benefit from a 2 pass and a puck to the net rule for a couple games, just to get them back in that motion of puck gets on your stick, throw it to the net. Puck gets on your stick, throw it to the net. Because there does seem to be a reluctance to shoot among a lot of elite shooters, which is interesting.
I want to see them dig, because I think back to a few games back where sometimes a broken play in the ozone led to a rush chance against. And maybe that's where some of their trepidation is coming from. Like, we don't want to shoot because we're so deep in the zone right now that we're worried about allowing a rush chance against. And we don't want to have that kind of vulnerability in our game anymore. I think you can't let fear dictate how you play in the offensive zone. And I think that they can make smart decisions still, but I think they need to think a little less. PD talked about a McKinnon dusting off the puck a few seconds too many, and it's not really doing anything to create time or space except for the defenders who are going to block your lane, and now you don't really have any options. I think you're right with the pass rule, because what I don't like about the passing right now is not only that it's 1 pass too many, but they're not moving with the passing either.
Correct.
They're just standing idly to catch pucks and send pucks. And that's incredibly easy to predict and defend against. And that's where the movement also adds to it. But also, just don't pass the puck as much. Just put it on net.
Well, I made the comment to you yesterday. I said there were, I think, 3 plays in particular that I made a note of where a Minnesota player was skating up with a stick in a lane. Closing on a puck carrier with a stick in a lane, and the Avs fired it right off that stick. It's like you're so predictable. They're blocking that pass 4 seconds before you make it.
Right.
That's how certain they are. They know where it's going. and that's a lack of movement because the puck carrier is not moving, and then the player that he wants to pass it to isn't moving. You're establishing lanes and then just letting defenses fill them. You got to make it more complicated than that.
Yeah, you got to make it more complicated and trust your teammates, which is why I'd like to remind everybody to go to trustedamerican.com to see how they can help you refinance your home and not have to make any payments until February. Trusted American's salary-based mortgage consultants want to help you get into a better interest rate and lower your monthly payments. And right now they will cover the cost of your appraisal, which is a $650 value. Go to trustedamerican.com or scan the QR code on the screen to see how much money they can save you today. All right. I think we got through most of what we intend to do today. I think we were going to preview the upcoming road trip a little bit. So you're going to be traveling, at least for the New York segment of the games. It's a 3-game road trip, so maybe a quicker road trip.
With a back-to-back in there, so a little bit shorter.
Yeah, so a quicker, what is your expectation for Boston, New York, and the Islanders?
I think these are 3 beatable teams. You got a back-to-back in there, so it's hard to say, I expect you to go 3-0. I think they need to come home from this 2-1. Because you're playing teams that you should beat. And that's where I want to see the Avs start settling in the back half here. You need to start beating all the teams that you should. You need to stop giving away the games. And it's easy to point to the Chicago one from a couple weeks ago.
Right.
But, games like that need to stop. Yes, they got the result, but the games like what we saw against the Rangers need to stop. I'd like to see them actually use that as a little bit of a statement game of saying, nope, this is who we are. Boston's a team that's fighting for their playoff lives. They're going to be desperate. You got to match that desperation, but also show why you are the better team. And the Islanders are kind of in that same conversation. So these are three games that I think as the Avs settle into who they want to be in the back half of the season here, my expectation is you come away at least 2-1, giving the benefit of you have a back-to-back.
I think the Avs are a team who play best when they have something to prove, whether it be to themselves, and they should always have something to prove. But sometimes I think the storylines work themselves in. So in back-to-backs, I think the reason they play well in the second game of a back-to-back a lot of the time is they have something to prove, that's a game that they're maybe not expected to win, so it makes them want to win it more. I think this generally applies even to the start of this season when they were overcoming those 3-goal deficits and they're depleted and they were able to string together some wins despite a difficult goaltending situation. They had something to prove. And so in getting reinforcement in net, I think that took off some of the burden of having something to prove. They were, mistakes were being papered over because of good goaltending. And so
when I feel like they're like, well, we have a goalie now, we have something to prove. And that lasted for a week. And then
you're right. Cause there was this immediate surge and then it kind of died down. And so I think they need to your earlier point about finding their identity, they need to find their why, find the thing that they have to prove. It should be there. All right. And I don't doubt that traces of it have been there all year long. This is a team with some of the best competitors in the world driving the bus. I haven't lost faith in that, but that's what I'm looking for in how they close out this homestand. You're playing in front of the home crowd one more time against a division rival. I want energy, not just in the Winnipeg Jets game, but also when they go on the road. I want energy, and I want them to get back to that component of having something to prove and playing from that way without needing to chase games or fall behind to incite it. I think that's why we see such great comeback efforts from this team too, is they're really inspired by the something to prove, but they can always have something to prove. They don't have to fall behind in games to do that.
Well, and here's your something to prove. There's people that are starting to think you aren't a contender. Now, again, the way I talked about earlier, I think they are. I think unequivocally they are. I think there's 7 to 10 teams that you could say, 7 to 10 teams that you could say that's a contending team if they can get it figured out. And to me, the Avs are absolutely one of them. No question about it for me. But I can understand why the outstanding narrative would be, is this a contending team? Can this team win a Stanley Cup? There's going to be people who are going to jump in the chat after I said that and say, no way can this team win. Use that as your fuel if you need it. If you're the Avs and you need it in the back half of the season here, say, these folks don't think we can win anymore. They think we're just here along for the ride to sell a few playoff t-shirts and get out of here.
They think we need Landy to return right now.
Right. So there's your motivation. If you're looking for a reason to feel like you've got something to prove, that's it right there. But I don't think this team necessarily needs that. I think this team just needs to define and establish what their identity is and go be that every night.
Yeah. Find some consistency in that. Well, I think that just about does it for today's Off Ice Guerrilla Sports podcast. We'll be back with game coverage tomorrow as the Avs take on the Winnipeg Jets to close out their homestand.
Should be fun. Bye, everybody.
Bye.